You found the Backup Wrap Up, your go to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In this episode, you'll hear the harrowing tale of what I'm calling the backup from hell, a project that started as a simple one time backup of 40 terabyte of two Synology boxes that turned into a 400 terabyte nightmare that took months to complete. We're talking hundreds of millions of files, with one directory alone containing 99 million of them. I'll share how I dealt with failing tape drives, ridiculously slow backup speeds, and ultimate solution that finally got the job done. If you've ever wondered what happens when everything that could go wrong with a backup actually goes wrong, this episode is for you. Plus, you'll learn some valuable lessons about what to check before starting a massive backup job. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. And I've been passionate about backup and recovery for over 30 years, ever since I had to tell my boss that we had no backups of the production database that we just lost. I don't want that to happen to you, and that's why I do this show. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap Up. Welcome to the show. And if I could ask you to just take one quick second and subscribe or follow us so you can make sure that you get all of this great content, that would be great. So I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I have with me a guy that apparently owes Ben Kingsley a huge apology, Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna? Why do you owe an apology?
So, as everyone's probably like, who is Ben Kingsley? So, if you don't know, he is an actor and he also played Gandhi in the movie Gandhi,
He did.
right?
Yeah.
And for the longest time, I was a little not upset, but like the fact that you have like probably one of the most important Indian people in history being played.
By a guy with the name Ben Kingsley.
Exactly. Yeah. Ben
So you-
Kingsley. And so today I found out that Ben Kingsley is actually Indian or
yeah.
half
How
Indian,
about
Anglo Indian,
that?
I should say. Yeah.
He's what?
He's Anglo Indian.
Anglo-Indian.
Yes.
It's like us, you and me. We're
Yeah.
Anglo-Indian.
So his paternal side is from Gujarat,
Uh-huh.
right? And his mom's side, I think, is European. His
Mhm.
dad was a physician who was born in Kenya.
Mhm.
And Ben Kingsley's name is not actually Ben Kingsley.
Yeah,
It's
it's a
like
stage name.
Krishna Banji, I think is his
Yeah,
name.
yeah, yeah.
And he realized that he wasn't getting called into the right casting roles when he was starting off his career. So he's like, let me change my name. And so he changed his name to Ben Kingsley, and people started calling him in and he started getting roles.
Racism in early Hollywood? Say it isn't so. Racism in current Hollywood? Say it
Yeah.
isn't so. Yeah, wouldn't be the
So
only person to do so, yeah.
yeah. So I apologize to Sir Ben Kingsley for all these years.
Yeah, you were putting it in the same category as the quote unquote Indian guy from the Short Circuit movie, which I don't know his name, but he is very much not an Indian
Yeah.
person. Do you know who it was? Do you have the name?
I'm looking it up. Or it's also like how Apu from The Simpsons is not Indian.
Yeah, he's played by I know the actor, but his name is escaping me.
So Fisher Stevens, is that who you're
Fisher
thinking of?
Stevens, yeah, Fisher Stevens.
Yeah.
Who
List?
those of you that watch Succession
Mm.
will Fisher Stevens was in Succession. He was a lawyer, a smarmy lawyer, which he
Yeah.
always
And
plays smarmy characters because he has
yeah,
kind
I
of
was
that
just
look.
thinking because I remember him from The Blacklist where he plays Marvin, the lawyer.
Yeah, he's got kind of that lawyer face. I'm glad that you finally realized the error of your ways.
But did you know he was
No,
Indian?
no, I
Okay.
didn't. Because I always brought it up just like you. Like I would bring it up
Yeah.
about Ben Kingsley playing Gandhi, and as just another example of would we call it brown face? I guess we'd call it brown face. Yeah, yeah. But people taking actor. And there's been a lot of those great roles throughout the years.
Yeah.
Great roles played by very not,
The,
people that are not of that ethnic group. Yeah.
and I think maybe also at the time, right, there weren't many Indian actors in Hollywood at all, right? And I would rather have the fact, or I would rather it like the movie be made
Hmm.
with someone who is non-Indian rather because it's a great movie. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
You've seen
It's
it,
a
right?
good
Yeah.
movie. Yeah. Yeah.
So I would rather have that rather than not having the movie at all.
Hmm. I see what you're saying. Yeah. And of course, we have the same challenge with Asian actors, right?
Mhm.
There's literally only 3 Chinese actors in all of Hollywood. Like if you if you look at like the Chinese roles, they've gone to literally like there's one guy, I forgot how many roles he's had, but he has had a prolific career playing every Chinese person that you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we're going to talk about something that we've alluded to a little bit on the podcast, sort of tell the final saga of what I'm calling the backup from hell.
Maybe we should probably phrase that slightly differently. It's
Really?
probably the backup that keeps giving. How
The
about that?
the backup that, yeah, what a mess. At the beginning of the story is that I was asked to do a backup of 2 Synology boxes that they were repurposing, right? So
Hmm.
they were going to move the data. They were going to reuse these servers, but they wanted to get a backup of the data before they moved it off of that.
Backup is good. Yeah, that's good
Backup is
before you
good. Yeah,
repurpose.
apparently they hadn't had a backup of these servers before, and then the and they said it was about 40 terabytes of data. That's the information that I was given. And after I had started doing the backup, I very quickly realized that 40 terabytes might have been an understatement.
You found additional data route, right?
I found
As you
additional
start digging.
data. Yeah.
Because,
So it turned out that
because
it wasn't like 40 terabytes of data. It was more like 400 terabytes of data.
yeah. And I'm guessing because these were systems that were kind of probably off on the side, they hadn't been used in a while. Like that's I think the problem. And I think we talked about this in one of our episodes
Hmm.
about sort of systems that kind of get stored away in the corner, no one worries about it, right?
Hmm.
And do you leave it powered on your old backup systems?
Yeah.
Right? We just talked about that. And
Yeah.
so I think that becomes a challenge. It's when you have these systems that are no longer actively being used, it kind of gets away from you.
Yeah, yeah. And so the customer really didn't have any idea just how much data that they were dealing with here. And it turned out to be, like I said, like close to half a petabyte of
Yeah.
data.
And for you that changes things significantly
Yeah,
because
it does. It changes the
like
backup
your
design like
backup target.
massively. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because your backup target, I think you had mentioned previously that it was like a server, right? That you were backing this data up to.
Yeah. I was backing it up via a server, a Windows server, and tape, right? Had tape, but it's sized like for 40 terabytes.
Yeah.
And so which is basically the server and the tape library was the perfect size for that.
Yeah.
But as I started realizing that it was filling up, and again, this is my fault for not really looking at the size of the data before really jumping in there. But basically, I realized very quickly that this was a whole lot more data
Yeah.
than
That you expected.
had been.
And
Yeah,
I think just kind of looking at lessons learned, as you're a backup admin who is being told, "Hey, this new application is coming online," make sure that you understand like what is the expected growth of that application because
yeah,
what you size for say a 5 terabyte database with a 1% growth is very different than like a file server with like a 50% growth rate.
yeah, exactly. And just because somebody says they have 10 terabytes of data doesn't mean that they have 10 terabytes of data.
So you mentioned you had a backup server, you had a tape drive. Is there a reason you chose to use tape in this
Well,
instance?
because tape is great for long-term retention of data, which is what this customer wanted. They wanted to hold on to this data for a long period of time, and that's where tape is great.
Hmm.
And tape also has if you're able to properly feed it, tape is actually can be quite fast. The challenge that I had when backing up this data was that for various reasons, which I think by the end I sort of figured out the core reason. For various reasons, individual backups off of these filers, they were just slow. Just they were
Like
just
how slow?
like slow was like like 3.5 kilobytes a second slow.
So like slower than like a 56K modem back in the day.
Yeah, right. And you can multiplex all you want. So first off, I was using NetBackup, which NetBackup, it did a great job at what we had available. Um, the the challenge was that because I couldn't put the client on the filers themselves, so there was a way allegedly to put a backup client on the filer, but I could never get that to work.
Yeah.
And so I had to back up over SMB. Because I'm backing up over SMB, I'm just limited to what that was, right? Whatever
Yeah.
speed I could get. And because I'm backing up over SMB, the client is just the backup server, right?
Yep.
So instead of running a backup from two clients, I'm running a backup from one client because it's the backup server. I'm backing it up over SMB. And because of that, I'm limited to the number of jobs I can run at one time. NetBackup says 99 jobs, which you say, gee, that sounds
I got
like a lot of
99
jobs,
problems.
right? But the thing is, towards the end, as I was running a lot of these backups, the aggregate speed of like 99 backups was only like 30, 40 megabytes a second, you
And you're
know,
talking about 400 terabytes of data to back up.
400 terabytes of data. Do the math. I backed up for months,
Yeah.
right? And I tried all these different things. Was I running too many backups at a time? Was I running not enough backups at a time? And then the problem is every test would take days or weeks.
Yeah. I think we should mention one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about these tests taking days or weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you want to mention sort of some of the issues you ran into with these long running jobs just due to infrastructure or
Yeah. So
other issues in the environment?
yeah, you backups are not made to run over weeks or months. Just backup infrastructure isn't made to work like that. And so when you do backups over weeks or months, weird things happen that cause, consternation. One of the things is LTO tape drives are great, but like we were using like the half height LTO drives, and as far as I could tell, their duty cycle was not meant to be 100% for 2 months, right?
Yeah.
They're meant to be backed up for several hours, and then give them a rest, and then back up several hours, and then give them a rest. I was just beating the crap out of these things for weeks or months at a time, and what would happen is after some significant period of time, it would just go right error. And that's fine when a backup runs for a few hours and then you just try again. But if it took you 2 weeks or 3 weeks to get to that point and then you get a write error,
And then it's not
yeah,
like you could restart these jobs either, right? I think you're running into
yeah. Well, I mean, I
issues
could
around that too.
restart them, but it's like after a period of time, I became I eventually got to the point where I said tape is not my friend.
Mm.
Anybody who
This
listens
is
to this
coming from Mr.
podcast,
Backup.
I know.
Yeah.
Anybody who listens to this podcast knows that I am a friend of tape, right? I believe strongly in tape for a lot of reasons. but I don't think that specific, and maybe my LTL friends can chime in here, but I don't think that these tape drives were designed to be backed up to like this for
Yeah.
weeks and months at a time, 24/7, with no, because as soon as I was multiplexing as many backups together as I could. And when one backup would finish, I would just add another backup onto it,
Yeah.
right? Because I could, what I couldn't do is I couldn't say, well, let's do these 10 backups, let them run until they're finished, and then we'll do the next 10 backups. And that would have given the tape drives a moment to breathe, I think. But I couldn't do that because we just didn't have that kind of time. And so I was just trying, tagging it on
And
there.
I know you've always talked about like the shoe shining problem. Given that you're not going very fast
Yeah.
with these backups, right? Do you think that also led to some issues as well for the tape
Y-
drives?
Yeah. So again, the core problem was that each individual backup was running slow. And no matter how many of them that I multiplexed together, it was not enough speed to make the tape drive happy. And so, yes, the tape drive was shoe shining. And when a tape drive is continually shoe shining, the tape drive will eventually fail.
Yeah.
And so everything I remember learning about tape drives was coming back to haunt me, right? This is all of the design that I had done throughout the years on backup, um, you know,
Yeah.
um,
And
backup system design.
system.
I wasn't allowed to do all of the things that, what do you do when the backups, and so I came to understand
Yeah.
that the only way I was going to finish this backup was to do it to disk.
Yeah. And just quickly before you move on, I think along the way, didn't you also have a tape drive that failed that you then had to go
Oh,
procure another one?
multiple times. Swap out tape drives, reboot tape drives, put in cleaning tapes in tape drives. And by the way, that's another thing is the way tape drives normally do is you run them for a certain number of hours, and then there's a cleaning tape that goes in there and cleans it. And when you have a robotic library, that happens automatically. Well, when you just run the tape drive for 2 months, that doesn't
Yeah.
ever happen. And so at some point, the tape drive just fails. And yeah. And so I ultimately decided that the only way to get this done was to, buy enough disk to back this up. And that wasn't cheap. Uh, but I didn't think that there was any other way that this was ever going to get done. Because again, the core problem that we've had with tape for the last 3 decades has been that if the backup isn't too fast enough for the tape drive, it's a fundamental mismatch of
Yeah.
technology, right? And so we use
Yeah.
multiplexing to make that better. But if the speed you're dealing with is in kilobytes a second,
Yeah.
it's not going to work.
Well, and especially because you're limited by those two uh, Synology boxes, right? Which are limiting your bandwidth, right? It's not like you
Yeah,
have 100 Synology boxes you can then pull from.
yeah. And I was watching, like I was running every kind of tool I could run to see, like I wasn't overtasking. That was the really weird part. Is that it's not like the Synology boxes were saying, hey, you're really beating the crap out of it. You shouldn't do so many backups at a time. It wasn't. It was. I didn't have a high I/O weight. I didn't have high CPU. I didn't have high RAM. There was no rhyme or reason as to why. We'll get to the rhyme or reason later. I figured it out. Um, but I knew the tape and this wasn't going to work. So I
Yeah.
had to bring in a couple of other Synology disk arrays, by the way, and populate them with enough disk to handle all of this backup, right?
Yeah.
And then
But
and
that
the
wasn't
other
without its issues
what's
either,
that?
right? When you brought those in, that wasn't without its issues either.
No, it wasn't without its issues. And the other thing, what I needed to do was I felt that in terms of the number of directories that were remaining, I wasn't sure like the different sizes. So what I did was I split those jobs into many smaller jobs. NetBackup is really good at like running thousands of jobs, right? So
Hmm.
rather than just have 100 jobs, I turned that into like 2,400 jobs. Like I went
Yeah.
another level deep and created a policy for each of these directories. And then I ran those, and it was running for a while. It was again, more time. And what I started seeing were these jobs that were like an individual job that was running an inordinate amount of time.
But you also had some jobs that would finish like super fast, right? Like within a
They'd
day.
finish in 5
Yeah.
minutes. Some of them, some of them finish in 5 minutes. Some would finish. But I noticed that over time, there were certain policies that were running for really, really long periods of time. And I eventually started poking around, and that's when I discovered what ultimately was the true culprit. And anyone who's been around backup for a long time has seen this culprit before. It's just, this is the worst example of this culprit that I've ever seen.
And what is that?
We affectionately refer to it as the million file problem. Because I remember, again, going back to that that client back from 25 years ago, we had one server that was going to be storing a bunch of images, and it was going to result in millions of files. And we knew that back then the million file problem is a real problem.
Yep.
And million file problem even over the network is even worse, right? Because everything is around.
Yep.
The way we fixed it back then was we used a product back then called Flash Backup, which would back up at the raw level but store the file level information. And that was not available to me. Why?
Because that product no longer exists?
No.
Because it doesn't run on a Synology box.
Right. Remember, the Synology box, all it was an SMB mount to me, right? Yeah. And by the way, for those curious, yes, I tested SMB, I tested NFS. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. By the way, this was a constant. You know the phrase "never go into battle with an untested weapon." This was a constant example of I am in the battle. I'm in the stuff, and now I'm trying to test stuff. And everything I did to try to make things better just made it take longer. And the client just had to wait. The client was incredibly patient, honestly. And you know, I did my best to say, look, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this, right? And hopefully that helped. But in the end, I was backing up. We got down to, I learned a way to identify which were the problem directories. So I would kick off a policy and I would watch, and I would notice that it had run for, let's say, an hour, and it listed, let's say, 300,000 files backed up, no kilobytes. Literally, there's a kilobyte column that shows how many kilobytes have been backed, and there's no value in there. We backed up 300,000 files, no kilobytes. And so that helped me identify these problem policies. So I would then kill it and let the other non-problem policies finish. And by that, I ended up getting down to like 150 policies that were the problem policies. And so I backed them up, and I was able to get them over time. I was able to get them backed up. And then finally I got down to about 20 policies, I think, somewhere around 25 policies. Go ahead.
And at this point, when you're down to the 20, like some of these have been running for a long time,
like 2
right?
months.
Like how?
Like 2 months. Backups that have been running for 2 months, successfully running for 2 months.
Yeah.
And what was good was at this point, again, like this is information that would have been really helpful to have at the beginning, but it was information that to get all this information at the beginning, it would have taken time to, like, we just wanted to get started.
Yeah.
What I ended up finding was that these backups, that there were millions and millions and millions. Like one of the directories that I was backing up, it had 99 million files in it.
Oof.
One directory, 99 million files. And eventually what I realized was that, again, the problem this time was just SMB.
Yep.
So the fact that every one of these files results in a round trip conversation, possibly multiple round trip
Multiple.
conversations.
Yep.
And I realized that the only way I was going to back up these truly problem directories was to back them up locally. But how do I back them up locally? Well, luckily, this is when I just, basically go back to dumb old native backup tools. And so I was able to run a backup using tar logged in locally on the filers, and then just directing the tarball across the network. And that finally worked.
That's crazy. So you had these 20 jobs, right? And
Yeah.
some of them you said were running for 60 plus days.
Yeah.
And then you sort of were like, okay, let me start this over. And by the way, you were kind of forced to start them over because something happened, right? At
Yeah.
like 60
Something,
days in.
again, some unknown thing. I think, I don't know. I actually don't
Yeah.
know
But
exactly what caused it, but they did fail.
yeah.
And
And you were like, I'm not going to start these again
yeah, I'm
because
not going to start them
at
again.
that,
It's just, yeah. Well,
yeah,
because like
because
one of the jobs, the one with 99 million files, we were nowhere near,
yeah,
you know,
after 60 days, you were
yeah,
barely
yeah,
scratched
we're
the surface.
barely scratching the
Yeah.
surface. So I'm like, I don't have, that, I don't have the amount of time that it would take. And
Yeah.
so I switched to, experimentally, once again, I'm experimenting on the fly. I'm doing development in production. I was like, well, let me see how quick a tarball would run. And I ran a tarball. I remember for like a day. You remember this? I ran a tarball
Yeah.
for a day, and I had a DU of the size of the directory, and after a day, it had done like a half of it or something.
Yeah. You're
I
like,
was
what
like,
was
oh,
taking 66 days and barely
yeah,
scratched the surface.
yeah,
You were mainly done, almost done within a day.
yeah. And so I was like, this is the way,
Yeah.
right? So it wasn't a way for everything, because this was, um because I'm glad that I use NetBackup for the bulk of it, because then I have the catalog data, and
Yeah. It'll become
but
easier on the restore side.
yeah. So this will be the restores will be more difficult for these like remaining 20 directories, but I mean not astronomically so. Like
Yeah.
I can create a tarball, a list
Yeah.
of this. So lessons learned, like don't do that. Don't store millions of files on the other side of an SMP box, I guess. I don't
Yeah.
know.
So, well, and I think a couple things, even if it's not SMB, right? Just having that many files, because I think what people don't realize is even though the size of every disk has gotten significantly larger, right? You're
Hmm.
talking like 18 terabyte, 20 terabyte disk drives,
Yeah.
they can only handle so many operations per
Right.
disk,
Right.
right? That number hasn't changed. It's about 100 per second. And so no matter
Yeah.
how big your disk is, right? If it was 20 1 terabyte disks, right? Then you get 20 times 100 IOPS versus if it's 120 terabyte disk, you only still get that 100. So that's a
Yeah.
big thing that people don't realize with these larger size disks.
Yeah. And the thing was that that many files. So because ultimately the problem wasn't disk IO. The problem was
Yeah.
network IO, right? Network latency.
Yeah.
So because when
Every
I actually
open.
I
Yeah.
ran two tarballs simultaneously is what I did, using like a
Yeah.
script. I was already running two at a time. When I was running two at a time, IO weight was sitting at 10,
Yeah.
which is high. But
Yeah.
I was like, well, it's got nothing else going on, so I'm going to
Yeah.
let it go, right? The highest IO weight ran during all of those hundreds of simultaneous backups was like 4.
Yeah.
So like I wasn't disk bound, I was
Yeah.
network bound, but not network bound in terms of throughput, network bound in terms of latency.
Latency because of the
And
number of operations, just
yeah,
because
yeah,
SMB is very chatty.
very chatty. It's probably the chattiest of the protocols.
Yeah.
And so
You
yeah, it
know,
was just a really bad combination.
yeah. And you know why? This is why backup vendors have their own protocols, like Data Domain has
Yeah,
Boost,
yeah,
right, to help alleviate and solve some of these issues.
yeah. You talked about don't do the somewhere we were talking about just don't do this. I'd like to talk to the when I looked at these uh, these directories that had these tens of millions of files. It was a structure that was very clearly created by some application. Every one of these directories had a common structure that was created by some, I'm going to say, stupid application that thought this was perfectly fine, that it was perfectly fine to create 99 million files for a
You know,
single item.
I bet they were using the file system as a database.
I don't know. I don't know what it was.
Given just like the number of files and the size of those files.
I know it was forensic type information,
Okay.
and I clearly don't know
That's
enough
fine.
about
Yeah.
forensic stuff. No, I'm just saying I clearly don't know enough about forensic stuff to know why they would want tens of millions of files.
Yeah.
But
so where are you? So you talked about these 20 jobs that you were
Yeah.
starting to do tarballs with.
yeah.
So where are you right now?
So we finished all of them but one. There was one that for some reason the file didn't look right. It was weird. The backup completed, but for some reason the tarball it just didn't look right. I don't want to go into details. It just didn't look right.
Okay.
And so I'm rerunning that one. So based on its size and how well it's doing, it should finish in about a day or so.
Okay.
And what I'm
Which is
also
a significant
doing,
improvement in terms of time.
a significant improvement, a day versus a year.
Or two, I think. Actually, it might have been
yeah,
two.
You're agreed. And what I'm doing is because again, I don't have the catalog. What I'm currently running is I'm running a tar TVF on all of those files and creating tarballs or creating, text files, a list of the files that are in there. And then I'm going to do a count on the files that are in there and check it against the count of the files that are in the directory. And hopefully those numbers should be the same.
Yeah. Because I believe you were even saying that to run things like a find to get a list of all the files in a directory or a DU took hours, right?
Well, it was days, actually. In fact, it was why I didn't have this information in the beginning, because everything was so big and every find, every DU, every command that I had. DU is quicker than find. It just does less work than find.
Yeah.
But the problem that I ultimately realized was that DU wasn't really being helpful in terms of the scope of the job.
Size,
what was really the scope of the job was determined by the number of these files. And I couldn't get those numbers because that was the thing that took forever. Once the number of jobs dwindled down to about 20, that's when I was able to run these the find commands, and they would actually complete. And that's when I realized just how bad it was.
So if you had to start this over, and hopefully you never do, but I'm just saying, if you had to go back to day one, what would you do differently? I know you talked about making sure you understand the size of your backups, right? It just feels like some of these you just have to go through the process, though, because you don't know what to do. Like, it's not like you could just start day one and be like, oh, I know I need to go to disk. I need to do X, Y, and Z, right? It's sort of like a learning process.
I would say that, because the problem is you're going off into the unknown. You're doing a backup of something that you don't know what it is. And I would say, if possible, if at all possible, get things like DUs, disk usage. It's a Unix command, but you can load those tools in Windows as well. If you're going to back up 100 directories, get a DU of every one of those directories so that you have an idea of just what you're dealing with. If at all possible, also look and see if the number of files, and if you're trying to do it's not that hard. You just run a find dot dash, I didn't even do a print, just find dot pipe to WCL, right? That was it, right? To get the number of files. I'd say if I could go back in time, I would say maybe do a little bit more of this research prior to beginning the job. But that's it's easy to say that now.
Yeah.
Because I know what I know.
2020.
Right. Yeah. But the core problem was that you've got these millions of files. I mean, which is already going to be a problem if you're backing it up in any sort of normal way. But if you're backing it up remotely over the network, it's going to kill you. Yeah. So, you got to figure out a way to do that. And then I would just say, see if there's anything that you can do with the application that's created this data.
Which is why it's important to get involved early on, right? When an application is being developed or
Yeah.
deployed,
Yeah.
right? To get involved so they understand the backup requirements.
Yeah. And so this backup that would never finish, I literally was I was starting to think that this thing was never going to finish. Like it's essentially finally found. I mean, it's not at this point, it's not 100%, but I'm now, I'm just
At the
waiting
finish
for one
line.
thing to finish.
Yeah.
I'm at the finish line. Yeah. It's nice.
I know one of the other things you mentioned that you were using that backup, but you had also looked at other tools out there as well, right? That could potentially help you with this effort, right? So, do you think that that becomes valuable, like either looking at other tools? I know you had reached out to like Synology support, you had reached out to some experts, like subject matter
Yeah.
experts,
Yeah. The
other things
problem
like
there were you could do like with Synology, you can like copy the data from A to B.
Mhm.
They have this ability essentially, like, for lack of a better word, they have SnapMirror. They have
Yeah,
the equivalent of SnapMirror
replication. Yep.
replication from one Synology box to another. But to me, that wasn't really a backup. Like I wanted in a format.
Yeah.
In the end, I was forced to not do what I wanted with the tar, but I wanted it in a cataloged format, right? So we looked at a couple of. The problem was never NetBackup,
Yeah.
right? NetBackup made it easy to script this whole thing because it was the only way I could make sense of it, because it was thousands of directories and even more thousands of subdirectories under those directories, and the only way I could make sense of this was to script it all. And the fact that NetBackup allowed me to do that was great. There are some other tools these days, some of the newer tools, they want to make it easy for you. But if you get into a complicated situation like this, some of the newer tools don't even have the ability to sort of grab it by the horns the way I
Yeah.
was able to do with NetBackup.
Yeah. I think the other thing also that you were doing, which I thought was interesting, was also your scripting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trying to automate this. Like I know, like scheduling the backup policies to run, right? And then you were sort of doing load balancing to make sure that you keep the two filers sort
Yeah.
of.
Yeah. I couldn't. Yeah. That was the thing. I couldn't. Normally, I believe in just throwing everything in the NetBackup scheduler and let it figure it out. But because of the limitations of the weird thing I had, I couldn't figure out a way to load balance across the two target filers using the NetBackup scheduler. Um, Maybe I could have done that better. I don't know. But so the way I was doing it was I was just assigning a backup. When a backup would finish, I would assign the next backup to that the filer that was now had more space available to it, right? So
Yeah.
I just had a while loop that was running,
Yeah.
checking to see if a
But I
backup
think
job was done.
but I think that's important, right? You can always script some of these things that if it doesn't exist in the native tools,
Yeah.
right? Don't be afraid.
Yeah, don't be afraid. Obviously, I'm pretty good at scripting, and I'm pretty good in the backup. And there are and thanks very much to Veritas for keeping their documentation online. The number of times I Googled, backup job, how do I list, and I know there's a command to do this. How do I do that? And then a man page would come up and I would read it and I was like, oh yeah. It's been a
Yeah.
while. Yeah.
And then you have to also thank Sigwin, of course.
Yes. Special thanks to Sigwin. Without Sigwin, that is the tool that you can download and run on any Windows server to give you Unix capabilities. I will say there were moments where Sigwin was both helpful and terrorizing me, because it was the whole like backslash versus forward slash thing.
Yeah.
Because in Windows, the file separator is a backslash, which in Unix is an escape character.
Yep.
And Sigwin wasn't consistent when that escape character would be an escape character. Like if you piped it into a file, it would do one thing. If you piped it into a command, it would behave differently. And so that definitely lent the fact that I was doing constant file manipulation on directories that were 7 levels deep did not help. Yeah. Oh, and then I couldn't. The one thing with Cygwin is that it doesn't see the to point the backups to NetBackup. I have to point them in the // filer name / share name. Cygwin doesn't see that. Cygwin sees only mapped drive names.
So you have to map it using the net.
You have to map
command.
it to a drive name. Let's say you map it to drive letter F, and then in Cygwin you would see /cygdrive/F, which would be the same as this / mount. But and I was constantly having to go back and forth between those two, and that was fun. Scripting.
So here's the thing: after all of this experience and everything you've learned, you're probably never going to use any of this again.
I don't know about that. I tell you what, I'm taking a tar of all those scripts that I wrote, because I will say this: that the NetBackup documentation, while extensive, it doesn't give a lot of examples, and so I'm thinking of like the BP duplicate command, which is the command to copy backups from one place to another. I couldn't figure out from reading the man page how to actually do what I needed to do. So I would have to run tests, not like now that Cohesity is acquired. It's not like they're now going to rewrite their man pages. I just thought that they could have used some more examples, but I figured it out eventually.
I think someone used to have a forum that people would post on about.
Yeah, someone used to have that. But people stopped posting on that forum. So I don't know what happened, I don't know where people are getting their help now, but,
well, I'm glad that this is almost over.
Yeah.
Nearly over. And I'm glad you're still alive.
I am alive. I didn't kill anyone along the way. I didn't scream at anyone like the story that those of you have heard where Curtis cussed Preston. Didn't scream at anyone. Yeah.
But I really, really, really think you should do an Office Space on those filers.
Yeah, well, that would sort of defeat the purpose of the repurposing, but I definitely like that idea. Anyway, well, thanks, Prasanna, for helping me sort of through this. You were my constant counselor through this.
I learned a bunch. I know usually I'm all about YouTube knowledge, but in this case, it was the Preston knowledge, so it was good.
Yeah. And thanks to everybody else for listening along with this sad story with, I think, a decent happy ending. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links from my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.